How it starts. My title of my first presentation is The Story of Covenant Creation. And I go into this with some fear and trepidation. I wrote this back in 2005 in the earlier edition of the book. I am also painfully aware of just how many proposals related to Genesis have been born in the last 200 years with high expectations, only to be buried later in unmarked graves in the cul-de-sacs of history. Their numbers are great. That sobering historical reality should foster care, temperance, balance, objectivity, and most of all, humility among all those who have an interest in this controversy. Of course, the Genesis debate is what I was referring to. And I stand by that statement today. I want to reaffirm that statement because I believe it just as much today as when I wrote it back in 2005. I don't believe really that I'm the right person to be doing this kind of work. And Jeff and I have talked about this a couple of times that there should be academics working on this stuff with the specialized training and the specialized experiences. And I feel like I'm at a handicap in all this. So I really want to say up front that I don't have all the answers. And there may be some things that I present here over the weekend that I go back and change or toss out. So bear with me as I blunder through some of this stuff. But I do want to address a few groups up front. To those who support covenant creation, I will say, beware of that context up there. Because that really is a sobering reality. There's been a lot of attempts at Genesis, and there's a lot of dead approaches now that I don't see any future for whatsoever. Beware of that historical context. Give it up if it doesn't work out. I want to say that up front. Give up covenant creation if it doesn't work out. To those who are curious, I will say, I will ask, listen to the material with an open mind, and that's really all that I ask. And to those who are critics, I will say that it is past time to deal with the biblical case for covenant creation and stop being sidetracked by issues of science, philosophy, theology, etc., etc. Let's start dealing with the biblical text itself in our discussions and in our conversations. We are here at the Covenant Creation Conference to make a biblical case, ultimately, for our views. And actually, we're still learning what those are and talking with different people. Interesting, Mark coming in with his presentation last time, he sees some of the very same things I'm going to be covering as well, so it might be a little bit repetitive. But we're here to make a biblical case, and I believe the objective listener will, in the end, agree that the case for covenant creation fundamentally is a biblical case. And so it's time to deal with the text. Now, what I am convinced of is that progress in understanding biblical eschatology will inevitably throw new light on the first chapters of Genesis. What if the missing key to Genesis is actually preterism? That's the question I want to start with. What if the missing key to Genesis is actually preterism? Wouldn't that help explain why there are so many long-standing debates over Genesis? A correct understanding of eschatology unlocks the entire Bible. We as preterists see that in the New Testament. We see it in various parts of the Old Testament. We see how stuff in the Bible comes alive like we never saw it before because of preterism. Now, why can't that be the case with the creation account? So that's really where I want to start. I believe as a preterist, and if preterism is true, always add that caveat, only as a preterist, I have hope to actually understand Genesis creation to some degree the way God always intended it to be understood. So when it comes to the story of covenant creation, I think we should begin by giving credit to whom credit is due. What we are doing today, in some respects, would not have been possible without the work of Milton Terry, who was, of course, the 19th century preterist theologian. This one simple quote captures what I see covenant creation as really talking all about. Speaking of covenant as creation, he says, Genesis creation, he says, it is as truly a sevenfold revelation of a beginning as the apocalypse of John is a mystic revelation of an end. See how that one quote captures really how I see covenant creation. What do we mean when we use the term covenant creation? Covenant creation is parallel to covenant eschatology. Same principles applied from the beginning that we already naturally apply to the end. If we say that the end is spoken of in biblical prophecy refers to the end of a covenant world and has nothing to do with the end of the physical universe, then covenant creation is the matching beginning. Covenant creation views Genesis creation as the beginning of that story that comes to the full end with biblical prophecy, particularly in the New Testament. So covenant creation views Genesis creation as literally about something. It's literally about something. But covenant creation denies that it is a plain record describing the formation of the literal physical universe as so many people think. So we have the same mistake in eschatology, right? That's the big hang-up that futurists have, is the physical universe concept of eschatology. They're waiting for the end of the physical universe, and that mistake skews all of the eschatological expectations, the definitions, and etc. So covenant creation is based on the idea that the Bible tells one overarching story from Genesis to Revelation. The story is ultimately about God's covenant relationship, God's friendship with His people. And through that story, which covers many diverse people over many time periods in the Old Testament, ultimately as the outworking of covenant creation, we learn lots of things about God, and we learn things about ourselves through the story. And we can understand this as preterists. I think we already have the tools to sort of understand. And the whole story points to a new world that would be fully unveiled once and for all, only at the very end. So covenant creation and covenant eschatology both differ from common views of the Bible. For example, Christians often believe the Bible prophecy is really about two different stories. And if you talk to those who study prophecy somewhat, you'll see this breaking out in the way they talk. They really talk about the Bible being two different stories. Bible prophecy specifically. One story is about the end of a covenant world, and another story, all mixed up here in this, is a story about the physical universe. And if the Bible presents two stories, then how many ends will there be in biblical prophecy? If you have two stories, then you're going to expect two ends, right? And one is the end of the covenant world, and the other is the end of the physical world. So we have two kinds of fulfillments. We have a spiritual fulfillment and a physical fulfillment. And people tend to separate those out because they're thinking in terms of two different stories. And that's also known, probably in your experience, as partial preterism, because that's what really partial preterism is all about. It's about the idea that prophecy is about two different stories, and we have to separate these two stories out in the New Testament and figure out what part of the New Testament prophecy is talking about the end of the covenant world, and then what part of the biblical prophecy in the New Testament is talking about the end of the physical world. So the partial preterist separates out these two stories, and we see them doing some pretty amazing things, like this parousia is for 80-70, and that parousia is for the end of the world. And that's what's really going on. They're separating out as if the Bible is about two different stories. So we see how that works with partial preterism. And here's what's interesting about this. It's common for Christians to do the very same thing with Genesis. They say that the story of Genesis is the beginning of two stories. Some say that Genesis 1 is a description of the scientific terms of the origin of our physical universe. And then we are told, and actually this is where it could be either Genesis 2, some people say Genesis 2 starts the second story, or some people say Genesis 12 with Abraham starts the second story. And then we have a covenant world beginning. Okay, and then that story, that covenant world, is the center of focus with the Scriptures. Now, covenant creation says, no. It's all one story, and that's what I mean by the story, singular, of covenant creation. That's what I'm trying to get here. It's the story of covenant creation. If there is one end, and it does not describe the destruction of the physical universe, then I would say the matching beginning does not describe the creation of the physical universe. So the real question is really this. Does the biblical evidence show that everything is interrelated from Genesis to Revelation? So when we pick up our Bible and we read, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, in Genesis 1:1, is that connected to when Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, in Matthew 24? That's really the question that we have. Are those things connected? Is it all one story, or are we talking about different stories? As preterists, we know what end Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 24, but does Jesus' statement take us back to Genesis 1? Covenant creation says yes, it's all one story, and that's the ending of the beginning that is introduced to us in Genesis 1:1. What God created in the beginning would pass away at the end. And if that's true, then a revolution of how we think about the end, a flip. And we all understand this as preterists, that when you became a preterist, your view of the end flipped to something different than what you had before. Okay? A revolution in our view of the end, there's a corresponding flip to the Genesis side. And so now Genesis looks differently as a preterist, because if it's all the same story, it's the beginning of that story, that end that we talk about with biblical prophecy. And really, just think about this for a second. Do you really believe that we could all change all of our views about biblical prophecy and have the exact same beliefs when it comes to Genesis as we had before we became preterists? That doesn't make sense to me. We're talking about serious substantive change with preterism. Well, preterists are really good at focusing in on the nature of the end, and they have been doing that for a long time. Now it is dawning on some of us that the nature of the beginning and the nature of the end have to match. The nature of the end, in fact, determines the nature of the beginning, and vice versa. We already know this is true regarding God's curse on Adam and Christ's redemption, right? The curse that fell on Adam is removed in Christ's redemption. See that? The nature matches. The curse and redemption, the nature has to match. A physical curse in Genesis removed by a spiritual redemption and resurrection in the New Testament does not work. We already understand that as preterists. Why not? Because the two different natures don't match. So if the curse is biological death and we still die biologically, and this is where futurists are, then they say Christ's redemption is not complete yet. And so futurism has a matching view of this as well. It's really not a debate about the fact that we have to have matching beginning and end. Everybody agrees with that. Now we're talking about what is the nature of what we are discussing from Genesis onward. If the curse is biological death and we still die biologically, then we are still living under God's curse. You understand that as a preterist. Now, I should mention at this point that the old earth view shows that the death that entered in the world at the fall cannot be biological death, for biological life and death had been going on for millions of years before the time of Adam. And so the old earth view requires a spiritual fall, which perfectly matches preterism's spiritual view of resurrection. Not quite yet. We'll get there. So for the old earthers listening out there, I want you to really consider that your view of the fall, as far as what happened when Adam sinned against God, you actually have a view of the fall that actually matches full preterism's view of the resurrection. It makes no sense to believe in a spiritual fall in Genesis and then insist on a biological redemption and a biological resurrection at the consummation, because it's all one story. It's all one story. We see how clearly that is when we read the New Testament and see all the imagery coming from Genesis, especially in the book of Revelation. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by this. Here's a real gem by James Jordan. Interesting that Mark used Jordan's material. I use it quite a bit myself. He says, and think about his view of the end here and what this means for his own statement on his own terms. Jesus' resurrection was a private vindication of who he was and what he did, but no one saw it took place, and Jesus only appeared to a few of his disciples. The destruction of the enemy city Jerusalem was his public vindication. Fulfilling Jesus' prophecies, it confirmed him as a true prophet and as the last and greatest prophet. It was the proof that he had indeed ascended to heaven and become King of kings and Lord of lords. Thus, the destruction of the old creation is of incalculable importance to biblical theology. But that's an amazing quote. Not just in what he's talking about with the destruction of Jerusalem, but look what he just said. And I consider Jordan to be a very, very bright individual, but I don't think he understood the implications of what he just said. Jordan says it was the old creation that was destroyed. Where does that begin? Now, if you read Jordan's stuff, you know very clearly where it begins, because he always talks about everything going back to Genesis. But the old creation destroyed? Here's another intriguing quote. Gabriel explains that this vision pertains to the time of the end. The end of what? The end of the first creation, which came to a full close in AD 70. The first creation ends in AD 70, according to James Jordan. But doesn't that tell us what the first creation was? Was the physical universe destroyed in AD 70? Did the physical universe come to an end in AD 70? No. So what does that tell you about the nature of the original creation? It tells you that it's not the physical universe that's at the center of Genesis creation. Now here's another example, and I've used this before, Don Preston. Don writes, notice how that in Revelation 21, the heavens and the earth pass away at the end of the millennium. The great day of the Lord was to occur at the time of the destruction of creation, at the judgment of Babylon, and since creation was to be destroyed at the end of the millennium, then the vindication of the martyrs in the judgment on Babylon was to occur at the end of the millennium. And so Don's over here arguing something else about the millennium and the timing of the millennium, and he talks about what? It looks to me to be pretty important. The destruction of creation is going to take place at the end of the millennium. Yes, that's what covenant creation is saying. What Genesis 1 through 3 does, Revelation 21 and 22 undoes. So AD 70 marked the final end of the old covenant age, the old world of types and shadows. The entire old creation has been recreated in Christ. We call it God's new creation, the long-promised new covenant. However, the physical creation was not destroyed and recreated in the first century. That fact provides a powerful demonstration that the Genesis in the beginning creation cannot be a literal record of the formation of the physical universe. The subject is something else. Just like in prophecy, we make that flip to a different subject, a different idea of an end, we make the flip with Genesis creation. Now, there are at least two passages that show you how this works. And I think these are pretty explicit passages. In the beginning, O Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. Of course, Mark beat me to this one, but it's pretty obvious. I think actually Hebrews 1, 10, 11 is the Matthew 24, 34 of covenant creation. It's the one that all the critics run from. It's the one that is really hard to deal with if you are a critic of covenant creation. I look forward to someone actually dealing with this text and looking at it in very careful detail to see how it works out for those who oppose covenant creation. So anyway, but can you see what the writer is saying? He's saying, and every commentary that I've looked at says it's, the writer's saying exactly what it looks like. That which God created in the beginning was designed to perish at the end. And all those commentaries, of course, they have a physical universe view of heavens and earth. So in their view, it's what God created in Genesis 1:1, and then it's future, going to pass away in the future because of their idea of the nature of the heavens and the earth, or the earth and the heavens. Their futurism has a matching view of the beginning and the end. Again, they see the connections, and their futurism is rooted ultimately, if you think about the big scheme of things here, it's rooted ultimately in the idea of the creation as the physical universe. And so what I want to point out is that the misplaced hope of Christians today, futurist Christians today, goes back to their understanding of what was created in the beginning. That's the root of futurism. It starts in Genesis 1:1 with their concept of what God created in the beginning. You can also see the link made plain in the parallel text of Revelation 21:1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I take this as the first heavens and earth, the first one as, the first one that the Scriptures mention in Genesis 1:1. And you note how the elements listed in the text draw from Genesis 1. That's where God created the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1:1, and the sea. And we see that also in Genesis 1. So you see the structure here of Revelation 21 perfectly matches the structure of Genesis chapter 1 with heavens, earth, and sea. Now, also interesting is the more immediate context before this passage, which describes the great white throne judgment of earth and heaven, Revelation 20:11, and the sea in Revelation 20:13. So, in fact, the judgment of both land and sea is going on here at the consummation. And I'm going to talk more about this more in my later presentations. John works, though, the important thing to understand here is that John works from the full context of creation, all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. He's working with those elements in mind. Now, I've tried to come up with a fitting analogy here that makes it easy to grasp this, because it's such an abstract idea. It's very difficult to get across to people because we're habituated to think a certain way. So I came up with this analogy, and it is an analogy of a covenant map. And it's really the best example that I could come up with. You might be wondering why this is a good example of covenant creation, but I think it is. We all recognize this, don't we? We know what this is, right? We see this all the time. And, it's interesting because you see all the states are in different colors, and we're in Ohio right now. So we should live in an orange state, but it's not orange on the ground, right? You see how it's something separate? And if you travel around, you're not going to see those big black lines that separate all the states on the ground. You're just not going to see it, okay? But that is a map of something, right? It's mapping the border. It's a true map, but it's not really a literal map in the sense of physical things. It's a covenant map of a political, societal order. And think about this. It's an order that had a beginning, right? Our country had a beginning in 1776, and then it had a transition period because between 1776 and 1789, we had a different form of government. So there was a transition period between 1776 and 1789 with the Constitution. And so even our covenant world that we live in, no matter where you go on planet Earth, you're a part of this covenant world as an American, right? But the North American continent, the physical land, existed long before this, right? We don't think of the formation of the universe as the beginning of the United States. Well, the ancients kind of do that, and we'll get to that more. But that is a covenant map. The map in literal terms is false. I mean, if you imagine somebody trying to take this map, not knowing the context, not knowing the cultural context, imagine somebody taking this map and going to see if it's true on their terms. What's going to happen? They're going to drive around. They're not going to see the different colors. They're not going to see the lines on the ground, right? And they're going to come to the conclusion that, wait a second, either that map is false in literal terms, or it's not mapping what I'm looking for, right? And hopefully they've come to, once they understood the context of the cultural context, they've come to the right conclusion and not say, no, this state of Ohio is actually orange. I don't care what unbelievers say, it's orange, right? It happens. Covenant creation is a lot like that map. It says that Genesis creation is using various symbolic elements to chart a covenant world that began at some point in time and came to an end at a particular point in time, but neither the beginning nor the end has anything to do with the physical universe, just like that map. So if you want to have a description of the physical things, then you're going to need a different map. You're going to need a topography map, right? If you want to see where the mountains are, a topography map works. Or if you want to see how the population is distributed, then you can get a different map for population to ask those questions, to define those issues. Or if you're a geologist, you'd be interested in a geology map, which is quite different still from all those other kinds of maps. And yet we're still mapping. Those are entirely different things, entirely different maps. Does that help you conceptualize what we're talking about with covenant creation? That's really the best analogy that I could come up with. Covenant creation suggests that Genesis creation describes the beginning of the old covenant creation that passed away in finality at the consummation of the first century. You see, the real question before us is simply this, and I know I've beat this over pretty hard. What is the subject of Genesis creation? That's the fundamental question that we have to get to. So what I want to do with the rest of my time is look at these various things and see if there are details in the early chapters of Genesis that will help us verify or confirm that the text is indeed talking about covenant creation. The real question is if the details in the text make more sense in terms of covenant creation symbolism than a description of the physical universe. In other words, do they check out? And so the rest of my time, I'm going to be sort of little investigation, little bit of an experiment to see if there is this, given this overall relationship from beginning to end that we see in various passages, let's check out and see if those those kinds of symbolic elements work. What would it take to verify covenant creation directly from Genesis? We can see how that works with prophecy. We can see things in Revelation that show us that prophecy is not talking about the end of the universe. Like Revelation 21 and 22, what do we find in Revelation 21 and 22? We find the healing of the nations. And yet people think this is the eternal state, right? And they just ignore that aspect in the text. Well, Revelation 21 and 22 is telling you that it's not the end of the physical universe or some new physical universe that was utopia and no biological death, no pain, no sorrow, whatever. It's telling you that there's going to be healing of the nations going on in this new heavens and the new earth. So, if I can show that there are details in Genesis creation like that, then I think I'm making a pretty good case for covenant creation. I think covenant creation could be demonstrated in Genesis if clear aspects of the law are being represented in the earliest chapters of Genesis. We would also have good evidence for covenant creation if the elements used in the creation are symbols, which in fact represent human beings. That would show that the creation is God's people. Just like we see the theology of the New Testament, the new creation, according to Paul, is God's new people. So it would be on the same terms as what we see all the way across the Bible. Now, the first thing we need to understand, and what is plain in Hebrew, is that there are two different words used of God's work of creation in Genesis 1:2. We got to get some immediate context here before we go too much further. First, there is bara in Hebrew, used only of God's act, which is usually translated as create in English. Then there is also asa, which has a slightly different meaning in Hebrew than bara. Asa is usually translated as made, like a craftsman makes something. So you take gold to the goldsmith and he makes some ornate piece of jewelry. That's a different concept of making things. And Dr. John Walton has this explanation of after surveying. It's an interesting article that I got this from because he surveyed all the use of bara in the Old Testament. And he came to this conclusion. As a Hebrew scholar, he said it should be noted that a large percentage of the biblical contexts of bara require a functional understanding. Incidentally, analysis of ancient Near Eastern creation literature confirms that ancient priorities were focused on the functional rather than the material. Isn't that interesting? He's no preterist, but yet his studies are taking him in Genesis to a functional understanding rather than a material understanding the ancient context. Dr. Walton is saying that the connotation of bara in ancient Hebrew is predominantly creation in terms of function, not in terms of material stuff. And I think that's very interesting as a preterist, because that's sort of how we think of the new creation in the terms of function, right? The new covenant is a function, a legal arrangement that is not necessarily not material in any tangible way, shape, or form. If Dr. Walton would be consistent, then he would apply the same principle to eschatology. The new heavens, the new earth is related to covenant function, not a new material universe. See, he's not consistent. He starts with a functional understanding of Genesis, and yet he falls into futurism, which expects a physical end of the universe. And it's interesting how this works. You find this in various mainstream scholars. I believe we can get a good view of the structure of creation if we diagram how bara is used in Genesis 1. A lot of people don't realize that bara is only used 5 times in Genesis chapter 1. There are the bara created, God created the heavens and earth in Genesis 1:1. God bara the creatures of the sea in Genesis 1:21, and then it's used 3 times in 1:27 with man on the land. And that's what's being created in Genesis 1. 3 things, really. Heavens, earth, and sea. Everything else in Genesis 1 about God making things, asa is used, like a craftsman makes things. So this deep structure of Genesis 1 is confirmed by the way the account highlights God's judgment and blessing. If you read the text, you'll see that the entire heavens and earth is created in Genesis 1:1, but then there is a specific pronouncement that links to the use of bara. So God bara the sea creatures in 1:21, and then what follows is, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters of the sea. And the blessing is also given to birds, too, of day 5. And then you have the same thing immediately following the bara of land, of man on the land, And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the land and subdue it, have dominion over fish, birds, and living things. So you see the similarity of that? It's like it's balanced. The creation account is balanced based on the use of bara in Hebrew and the blessing that God gave to the creatures of the sea, the birds of the air, and man on the land. God wanted the sea to be filled and the land to be filled. And the only difference was that in this world, man on the land was given dominion over the creatures of the sea. Now, why would God bless creatures of the sea? Now, what makes this interesting, I'll give you a hint. Later in the Bible, God goes fishing. And Mark's already touched that off a little bit. But later in the Bible, God goes fishing. And so we have this blessing of the fish of the sea and the blessing of man on the land right in the beginning in Genesis 1, and they're parallel. Now, what makes this interesting is the form of that blessing and command, be fruitful and multiply, is repeated a few times in Genesis. We see it again with Noah after the flood, Abraham and the circumcision covenant in 17:2, and Jacob at Bethel with 35 in Genesis chapter 35. Elsewhere in Genesis, that blessing is always given to people. In fact, you see this thread through Genesis as it focuses in on the story of Abraham and his descendants. It's given to man on the land. People of the land. Now, do you find it odd that at the very beginning God would give a very similar blessing to fish? Does that seem odd to you? It seems a little odd to me that the same blessing that God's giving to Abraham and Jacob and Noah after the flood, God gives to fish. So we have a little question mark here, I think, that should warn us that maybe it's not talking about exactly what we had in mind. By following the term bara in the account, along with the obvious parallel of blessing that follows upon what God creates, bara, I will suggest that the structure inaugurates the covenant function of Gentile and Hebrew. And again, Mark got a little head start on that. That is, the creation of the creatures of the sea and man on the land represent covenant jurisdictions which manifest themselves throughout the entire old creation. God is blessing people. That's really what I'm going to argue here. God is blessing people. The fish of the sea are representing a certain jurisdiction in the old covenant world, in the old economy, and God is blessing the creatures of the sea. You can also see this employed in the architecture of the tabernacle and the temple, which is designed to represent, again, the same threefold structure: heaven, earth, and sea. And preterists have done a lot of research about the structure of the temple and how it represents. And where do you find the Gentiles? You find them in the outer courts, at the outer edges, in the court of the Gentiles, which is considered sea. Israel had access to the center of the temple with the inner courts, and that is the land. And of course, the Holy of Holies, where God dwells above the mercy seat, is heaven. So heaven, earth, and sea. You see that same structure in Genesis chapter 1. So consider and ponder that connection between the temple and the tabernacle and Genesis creation. But ultimately, I think Jim Jordan gets it right. It's really as simple as this statement: the great sea represented the Gentile world, for land is always Israel and sea is always Gentiles. So I think we got a hint there that we're talking about people in the creation account. The fact that creation is focused on people is confirmed by the language used in the creation account. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. Genesis 2:1. Note the heavens and earth language there. That should be very familiar to you as preterists. The host is associated with the heavens and the earth, and the underlying word for host in Hebrew is a common Hebrew word used of God's people in other texts. In other contexts, in other places, we find hosts referencing God's people. Israel came up out of Egypt as a mixed multitude, God's host. Okay? Because Israel came out of Egypt not just with Hebrews, they came out with other people as well who adopted the faith of Abraham. And so Israel comes out of Egypt as a mixed multitude, God's host, Exodus 12:51. The same Hebrew word is found that we find here in Genesis 2:1. Another 4 examples can be found in Daniel's prophecy regarding the persecution of God's people, all of God's people, in the last days, and the subject here of the account, I believe if you look at Genesis 2:1 as a concluding statement of the creation, the subject here, it tells us, is that the account is the host or God's army, all of God's army, which is a new people. I think Genesis 2:4 gives us another indicator. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and heavens. Why is it that heavens and earth involve generations? Because if you look at generations as you go all the way through the book of Genesis, every other example, when it talks about generations, it's talking about people, the history of a people. And I would submit to you, like following up on what Mark said, that this is really the very beginning statement related to people. Of course, the creation of, that is Bara, the sea creatures, and man on the land follows the earlier order of creation in Genesis 1. The firmament which God made, Asa, on day 2 divided the waters, plural, and the land, rose up out of the waters on day 3. And people have offered all kinds of different scientific explanations of what this is all about, the land rising up out of the sea. But let me put an idea in your head. The Hebrews were called up out of the nations, right? Abraham was called up out of Haran. Children of Israel were called up out of Exodus. And so I submit to you that that could be understood very clearly, very easily in terms of Israel's history as being called up out of their surrounding Gentile cultures. And I think that's ultimately what's going on with Adam as well. I think Mickey got that one just right. The land rose up out of the sea, and the formal division came when Abraham was given circumcision, which permanently divided Hebrews from Gentiles for the rest of the old creation. So there's this prophetic element here that's going on in the creation account. It's foreseeing covenant history as well. It's foreseeing what's going to happen in this story. So also you can see how this the parallels between the sea and land, days 2 and days 3, and the creatures of the sea on day 5, and man on the land on day 6 match. So there's this internal parallelism. 1 through 3 match days 4 through 6 in the creation account. That's a real good example of poetic parallelism in Genesis 1. It's really a structural parallelism that shows that these things are matched up. So that covenant structure illuminates the focus of Genesis 1. And since both Hebrew and Gentile jurisdictions are set up in Genesis 1, the name of God used in that account is Elohim. And Elohim is the name that we see in the Bible that's used of God by Gentiles and Hebrews alike. It is the Most High God. And unfortunately, this doesn't come across in English translations very well. But when we get to Genesis 2, the name for God is switched. When we're dealing with man on the land and the garden, we've got a different name for God, Yahweh. All right? And I think that nuance is very important to understand, but our English translations really let us down because we can't see the shift there that the context does with the use of different names. The detail in Genesis 1 is linked to many more details in the law. The 7 feasts of Israel's calendar are linked to the 7 days of Genesis 1. There's been many studies that show how the feast of Israel matched the order of creation. So there are 7 feasts that match the 7 days of creation. Also consider that Solomon built the temple over a week of years, according to 1 Kings 6:38. And it's not a week of days, it's a week of years in that case, in that text. The dedication of the altar in the temple came with a week-long celebration and dedication of the whole temple. Okay, and then it came with another week-long celebration to dedicate the altar where the sacrifices would be brought in the temple. So we got creation weeks going on here all over the place. And I'm suggesting that these are all related. One place where the covenant function of creation is most obvious is with the sun, moon, and stars of day 4. Following the parallel from day 1, Genesis 1:14 and 15 says, Then God said, Let there be lights in the firmament to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. Read that in terms of covenant function and see if it works. No C here. Light for the land. And the word for creation in this term on day 4 is not bara, but Asa. And here's the key. The text presents a worship background for the function of the luminaries. Bernard Ram gives this explanation. I was stunned to find this in a book that was written back in the 1950s. He says the sun and moon were to function, functional understanding, for man for seasons. By analysis of the usage of the word seasons, Maunder indicates that it means religious seasons, not the 4 seasons of the year. The position of the sun indicated the various times for daily sacrifice, and the position of the moon for monthly sacrifices. 7 was very important in the whole Jewish economy, and it figured in their astronomy and religious seasons. And I submit that explains why the sun, moon, and stars were given to give light to the land, Israel. That's the distinction there that we're looking at. The Jewish sacrificial system was given to reveal the knowledge of God to his people, Israel. Signs and seasons are related to covenant worship, as are days, Sabbath days, and years, Jubilee years. And actually, if you go look at Paul in Galatians, he talks about signs, seasons, years, and days. He's getting that from Genesis chapter 1. And we, of course, understand what he was talking about with that issue of celebrating signs and seasons and years. There is no mention here on day 4 of light to the sea, because the Gentiles were not called to participate in Israel's festival calendar and sacrificial system. The luminaries give light to the land or earth. Same word in Hebrew. In the new heavens and new earth, there is no need for the sun or moon to shine, for the Lamb is the lamp, according to Revelation 21:23. In the new heavens and new earth, the light of the knowledge of God comes through Jesus Christ, who is the true light. I am the light of the world, and true temple. See the contrast there? It works pretty well if you look at Genesis creation as being related to the Old Covenant creation, and the new heavens and new earth talking about the new covenant creation in Jesus Christ. The old order, including the sun, moon, and stars, has passed away. And so this pattern here that we see at the end of the book of Revelation is rooted in original creation in Genesis chapter 1. It is all about the old covenant order and the new covenant order. Well, the creation week ends with day 7, which has no evening and no morning, no beginning, no end. And people tend to overlook this, but day 7 has no evening and morning. I suggest that that is a reference that at the end of the age, the sacrifices were going to be obsolete. And we see that cessation of sacrifices by the early Christians coming out of Judaism as they fled Jerusalem, etc. Other passages like Hebrew 4 connect day 7 with God's rest and the people's salvation. Speaking of the Sabbath, do you realize that the creation is the basis of the Sabbath law? What does Moses say? For in 6 days the Lord made, the word there is Asa, the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Notice the structure of creation in that passage. And the source of the authority of the Sabbath law is based in creation. Genesis chapter 1. That's where Moses goes to explain it. Now, if Moses anchors the Sabbath command in creation in Genesis 1, and Moses says it's in the law because it's part of the creation from the beginning, think this through. If Genesis 1 is describing the formation of the physical universe, and Moses anchors the 7th day Sabbath in the creation of the universe, and we still live in this creation, then doesn't it stand to reason that the 7th day Sabbath is still binding? That's the authority that Moses points to when he gives the Sabbath law. He says the very same thing in Exodus 31. You can look up that at another time. But are Christians still called to keep the 7th day Sabbath? Do we live in this creation? Do we live in this creation? The only way, theologically speaking, that the external Sabbath day observance could become obsolete in Christ is if this entire creation has passed away and we now live in a new heavens and a new earth, where, in the words of Paul, there's no reason for God's people to celebrate special days and months and seasons and years. Paul's statement is echoing Genesis chapter 1. And so I will say it plainly. If the subject of creation in Genesis 1 is the physical universe, then we are all obligated to observe the seventh day. But now we have a real big problem, don't we, as preterists? If we're still observing the Sabbath day, then the law hasn't passed away. And we should not be preterists anymore. And so there is an argument I'm going to lay out there for covenant creation that if you believe that the physical universe is being talked about in Genesis chapter 1, you are an inconsistent preterist. Because you believe you still live in that world. Moses based the Sabbath law in the original creation. So if we live in Genesis chapter 1, we are obligated, as Moses lays out the example, to celebrate the seventh day Sabbath. In which case, all of the law has not passed away. I think that's a pretty interesting argument to think about. Creation cannot be separated from the Mosaic law. Creation and law are united in the way it's presented. We should understand the unity of the law and creation from the prophets because they do the very same thing. Look how Jeremiah uses this language straight out of Genesis 1 to describe Israel's state of idolatry before the Babylonian captivity. I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void, and the heavens, they had no light. Now, the wider context of that passage, if you read it carefully, matches Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in the details that the prophet Jeremiah mentions in Jeremiah 4. We find that the fruitful land had become a wilderness, paralleling day 3. We find that the birds had fled, paralleling day 5. And there was no man, Jeremiah tells us in Jeremiah 4, matching Genesis 2:4. Or 2:5, excuse me. What is most remarkable is that the prophet uses the exact same language we find in Genesis 1:2, without form and void. What is the prophet saying? He is saying that the world of Genesis 1:2 had come undone because Israel had broken covenant with God. And in the context, he's talking about what? The judgment of Israel, 586 BC, and Judah, and the destruction of the temple. Jeremiah 27, we're going to see this more later, shows it was not just Israel here in this text, but other nations too, nations of the land that knew God in some way. The Gentiles, the sea, knew God in some way. We're going to see how all that works out. They too broke covenant with God, and so it's the whole land that is without form and void. The whole creation from the very beginning, including Gentile nations who had broke covenant with God. And so the earth was without form and void. And in the heavens, they had no light. What is the prophet saying? I think these are good examples from other scholars that I run across fairly regularly. G.B. Caird explains it as Jeremiah's vision is of the whole creation returning to its primeval chaos. In the first line, he uses the phrase tohu wahu, which is used elsewhere only of the empty turbulence out of which God created heaven and earth. Sailhammer, Dr. John Sailhammer, a very prominent Hebrew scholar, has an even more striking statement on this passage. When Israel disobeyed God, the land became again uninhabitable. The way in which later biblical writers reuse the terminology and themes of Genesis 1 suggests that the notion of the land in this chapter is more circumspect than it is usually taken to be. The common understanding of the term land, eretz, in Genesis 1:2 is earth or inhabited earth, the globe is what he's getting at. Jeremiah 27:5, however, shows that later biblical writers read Genesis 1, the later revelation interpreting the first, as referring primarily to the land promised to the patriarchs and to Israel. See, he's relying on what the prophet's understanding of Genesis really is to define Genesis. And that's a good method. Preterists should recognize that. That's a sound method of interpretation. The point, though, is in what Jeremiah was talking about with the prophecies of the destruction of Jerusalem, we're not talking about the physical universe. The physical universe didn't collapse and then get recreated after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. The prophet, like the author of Genesis 1, was describing the state of a covenant world, the very same covenant world made in the beginning. And I think we should not overlook the famous prophecy in Isaiah 65:17, which repeats the exact same language of Genesis 1. For behold, I create bara, new heavens and a new earth. Same language in Genesis chapter 1, though future, in contrast to Genesis chapter 1. So pay attention to the detail of that passage. And what's interesting about Isaiah 65, he anticipates exactly what John's talking about in Revelation 21. Because if you read Isaiah 65, guess what's not in there? No mention of it. No sea. Right. Everything in Isaiah 65 has to do with the land. Because what the prophecy he's looking forward to is the same prophecy that John saw as being fulfilled, and there was no sea. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. In this new creation, in the new covenant, in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. And I have a whole presentation designed to show why this was such a big deal in the Old Testament. Why this jurisdiction issue between Jew and Gentile was such a huge theme of the New Testament, and really a big argument in the New Testament. Now I'm out of time, but I'm going to continue with just a few more listing of details from Genesis 2 and following, which alert us to the roots of the law and the Mosaic worship economy. The golden lampstand with branches represents the tree of life. It's actually in the form of a tree, the light stick. The cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, guarding the gate to the garden, also find themselves on the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies. Same cherubim. The gemstones that were placed on the priest's ephod are the same gemstones mentioned in the garden in Genesis chapter 2. And then we find linen clothing worn by the priest was designed to prevent sweat. Sort of an interesting detail, given the curse of God was that in the sweat of your brow you must labor. But also we find animal sacrifice in the garden, the very first sacrifice of animals for the skin, for the covering of Adam and Eve. So that takes animal sacrifice back into the garden at least. That's where it originates. And we also find in Genesis 4 that, and this is one real easy to overlook, you have Abel who brings the firstborn of his flock. We think, firstborn, that doesn't mean anything. Well, yeah, it does. Because Israel was to give the firstborn of all of their flocks and herds and their children to God. So even there in that story with Cain and Abel, Abel bringing the firstborn of his flocks is connected to the law of Moses and the fuller revelation that Moses brought, the full, complete revelation. The passing away of the law in terms of covenant creation means that the passing away of the law entails much more than we preterists often realize. The passing away of the old heavens and the old earth and the sea takes us all the way back to that which God created in the beginning. Jesus said the judgment to come would involve all the righteous blood shed on the land from Abel on. See, Jesus is going right back to the very beginning of the story when he talks about that in Matthew chapter 23. So the inescapable conclusion of covenant creation is that Genesis creation is not given to tell us anything about the physical universe. And if that is true, then it has profound implications for Christianity and our culture. It means the time has come for Christians to stop turning the Bible into a science book. And this is a message that may get criticized from a lot of different angles and from a lot of different groups. But the time has come to stop forcing the Bible to speak in a way that it was never intended about things it was never concerned. The Bible is not science. That's really the heart, one of the central ideas of covenant creation is about God and His covenant relationship, His friendship with His people from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22. Are we talking about real history? Yes, I do believe we're talking about real history, covenant history. Real stuff, real people involved in a very ancient way of communicating and artistic and sort of visual way of communicating. You see, it's all one story. And here's the remarkable thing about this. It's all one story. In one sense, not a bit of what I just presented is even new. Because even scholars of every persuasion understand that it's all one story. I'm actually working from the framework of Christian theology from its earliest days in the early church history. Because if you go back and you read the early church fathers, what do they view creation? They view creation in terms of its relationship to the consummation. Creation and consummation are connected. And I found this quote. If you go back and you read early church fathers, they make the connection. If you read medieval scholars, they make the connection. And modern scholars even present it even more developed, like this quote from John H. Sailhammer. Just listen to this and understand what he's saying. He's not a preterist, by the way, but I want you to look at the connections that he makes. The term beginning in biblical Hebrew marks the starting point of a specific duration, as in the beginning of the year. The end of a specific period is marked by its antonym, the end, as in the end of the year. In opening the account of creation with the phrase, in the beginning, the author has marked creation as a starting point of a period of time. Does that look familiar to you as preterists? Hence will here be the beginning of the history that follows. The history to be related from this point onwards was heaven and earth for its object, its scenes, its factors. At the end of this history stands the creation of the world as its commencement, or at all events its foundation. By commencing this history with a beginning, a word often paired with its antonym end, the author has not only commenced a history of God and his people, but also prepared the way for the consummation of that history at the end of time. Do you see the switch he just did? He just switched from a functional understanding related to time to the physical universe. He's a futurist. He's not consistent. The growing focus, but he does see the connection. And that's what I want to get at. He does see the connection. The connection that has been historically understood with Christian theology from its early days. The growing focus within the biblical canon on the times of the end is an appropriate extension of the end already anticipated in the beginning of Genesis 1:1. The fundamental principle reflected in 1:1 and the prophetic vision of the end times in the rest of Scripture is that the last things will be like the first things. Behold, I will create new heavens and a new earth. Then I saw a new heavens and a new earth. The allusions to Genesis 1 and 2 in Revelation 22 illustrate that role that these early chapters of Genesis played in shaping the form and content of the scriptural vision of the future. Already in Genesis 1:1, the concept of the last days fills the mind of the reader. See, Christians have always taught that the beginning and the end have to match. And so I really want to affirm the historic framework of Christian theology. What that means is that in order to embrace covenant creation and covenant eschatology, you're actually embracing the historic framework of Christian theology from its very beginning days. We know what it's like to be preterists. Isn't it a lot better to honor the biblical framework and simply re-examine the nature of the beginning, just as we have already re-examined the nature of the end? Isn't it the better view, covenant creation, combined with covenant eschatology? Thank you for your time.